If you're in the process of buying a 4x4 wagon, you've probably come to a fork in the road fairly early on in the buying experience. Do you go for cheaper versions of established nameplates like the Ford Everest and Isuzu MU-X in their low grades, or do you go for more affordable options out there in their high trims which have all the features that you want? With me today is one of the vehicles that falls in the latter camp, the Ssangyong Rexton, which joins newcomers like the GWM Tank 300 and 500 in Australia in carving out a legitimate path for those who understandably want to spend a bit more money on their holidays and not just the vehicle that helps them get there. But unlike those two vehicles, the Ssangyong Rexton behind me is not a new vehicle. It's been kicking around Australia in various forms since about 2018. But in 2024, it's been given a pretty substantial update that's lifted it up to a pretty high degree. But is this update enough to make it our pick over those Chinese rivals? And does it have enough underlying talent to challenge the big dogs? Today, we're going to find out. But before we get started on today's video, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also follow us on TikTok and Instagram if you want to see more content like this. Chasing cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Now, as you can probably tell, we've been having a little bit of fun with the Rexton this week. We've taken it off-road, which we're going to talk a little bit more about later on, and I've also done the whole daycare runs and family duties and even picking up some stuff from Marketplace. So really done the rounds in the 4x4 wagon life. Now, for 2024, the Rexton range has been given a bit of a spruce up. Namely, the big change is that it's gone from 2 grades to 3 grades. The starting one is the ELX. That starts at about $50,000 drive away. Now we've got the Adventure, that's $54,000 drive away, and this is the Ultimate. So this is $58,000 drive away, and on top of this, you can also go for a Sport Pack, that's an extra $2,000, and for that you can get some 20-inch wheels over these 18s and some darker accents around the car. Now, while we're on the outside of the vehicle, I want you to take note of the squarer bumper design at the front here, and also the fact that it's only got 203 millimeters of ground clearance. More on that later on. But for now, let's talk more about the updates, which are almost entirely concentrated on the inside. Jumping into the interior of the 2024 Ssangyong Rexton now, and look, it's got the same sort of conventional layout that we've had previously, and in ways this is a bit of an advantage over the Chinese rivals. Namely, we have separate climate controls down here. They're not all integrated into the touchscreen. More on that in just a sec. In terms of other parts of the fundamentals of the interior, we've got a nice steering wheel here. I really quite like this. These buttons are really prominent and they feel decent to press. It's leather all the way from the base model. The seats themselves, look, they're a bit of a mixed bag. I've got a bit of a short seat base, but I do have a bit of bolstering that holds me in place. So all in all, I'll probably give them a C, I think. In terms of material, we do have cloth on the base model, steps up to synthetic leather on the Adventure, and the Ultimate I'm sitting in has more of a higher grade real leather. So that's certainly nice to see. But let's move on to some other changes for this model year. So directly in front of us, we have a 12.3-inch digital driver's display. Look, that's nice, but I don't really think it's a bit of a game changer. It doesn't do all that much, and it is a little bit slow. Unfortunately, so is the central touchscreen we have here. This is also 12.3 inches in size. The main issue I have is the fact that it's really quite slow. And this also includes things like, for example, when I hop into the car, I'm in a rush to go somewhere, I'll pop it in reverse, I'll reverse out, and I'm about 10 seconds down the road before this thing boots up entirely. And that means, unfortunately, that I don't have access to things like the reversing camera when I'm in a hurry. And sometimes, even when it's activated, the frame rate is really quite slow. So, you know, it's unfortunate it doesn't have the processing power behind it to really support this new screen. Another annoyance of this new screen is, unfortunately, when I go here and I press the climate control, turn it off and on, modify the settings, for some daft reason, they feel the need to beam it up into the touchscreen as well. I don't really understand why. There doesn't seem to be more controls up in the touchscreen than there are here. As you can see, there's actually quite a lot of buttons down here for your climate control, but they felt the need to do so, and that means that when you've got your maps up here, you need to wait for it to go away every single time you press a button, and it beams up and replace that in the central touchscreen. Really a bit of a silly move there. In terms of some good bits about this interior though, there's a few things I'd like to point out. One is the fact that there's just a lot of soft touch materials everywhere. You know, it's quite nice to put your arm on this armrest. This is padded here, that's quite nice, and even on here on the doors. Now you notice that a lot of these materials are cheap feeling, but evidently the result is that they feel nice and comfortable to put your arms on. So if you're not too fussed about not having the flashiest rig in the books and you just want something that's fairly comfortable and competent, this is a pretty good thing. Also point out in this latest update, they've moved to USB-C, which is really, really lovely, bringing us into the modern age. I also really like the amount of features we have on this fairly affordable model. Things like heated and ventilated seats. We don't have a lot of that even in the more expensive rivals in this class. We've also got a heated steering wheel, really lovely indeed. Finally, I'll say that on this model, which is the Ultimate, we have some slightly nicer seats, as I said, finished in leather. We also have a sunroof up here, but I'm not sure that's worth the extra expense in my eyes. But that's enough for the front, let's jump in the back. Jumping in the back seat now, and look, I think overall this is a pretty good place to be. I'm 6 foot tall and sitting behind my own driving position, I've got a good amount of room. Decent amount of knee room, and even with my big boots on, I still have a good amount of toe room. Look, the floor is a little high, and rivals like the MU-X do have more under thigh support, but you know, like certainly not the end of the world. There's also a good amount of amenities back here. You know, unfortunately that sunroof doesn't go all the way to the back like it does in some models, but we have things like rear heated seating. I'm not sure there are many ladder frame SUVs out there that offer that. That is pretty darn impressive. We've got, of course, some extra vents back here to keep some circulation going around the cabin. And I've also got some grab handles here and also here when the going gets tough. So certainly fairly nicely equipped back here. Pull down the armrest as well. And look, this feels reasonably sturdy. Moves around a little bit, but not too much, I suppose. And we have a little bit of extra storage. Very nice indeed. I should also note that we've got some USB-C ports down here and another 12-volt port. I think it's actually really impressive how many 12-volt ports are in this car. We've got one on the inside of the glove box, one back here, and another in the third row that we'll have a look at in just a sec. So yeah, if you want to charge something, this is your car. Now, if you've got kids like I do, here are some extra things that you should keep an eye out for. One, the second row unfortunately doesn't slide forward, though it does fold fairly flat. So that's certainly very nice. You've also got privacy glass in this top spec Ultimate. That's certainly nice to have. And on the topic of baby seats, this is another strength for this vehicle. I've been doing the daycare runs this week and I have had a rearwards facing baby seat behind the front passenger here. And I have found that I've been able to fit it in there without much compromise at all to the front passenger. So that's certainly very nice and not something I can say for every vehicle in this segment. The door also opens fairly wide and the height of the vehicle does make fitting said baby seat fairly easy. I'll also note another thing that was a bit of a surprise advantage in fitting the said baby seat is that you have the ability to move the front passenger seat forward using these buttons here. This is a bit of a thing that we see on Korean cars and not other markets, seen as more of a luxury feature, but it also has the side effect of being great for fitting baby seats, so you don't have to run around and adjust that chair all the time. So, you know, another good mark for the Rexton there. Sitting in the third row now, look, I don't have a lot of room back here. My knees are pretty squished up against here. This is probably one of the tighter third rows I've been in my head. Look, it's not welded against the ceiling, but it is pretty darn tight. Certainly not as good as segment leaders like the MU-X with their third row in this respect. Though I will say in general, third rows in 4x4 wagons aren't great. So this is probably just kind of on par. But look, in general, I think this is more of an occasional use space, but the one reason that it might be okay to use this more often for things like kids who are a bit smaller who can fit here easily is the fact that we do have third row airbag coverage, which is really fantastic to see and not things we see, for example, on the Pajero Sport currently. Unfortunately, we don't have an ANCAP rating for this car at the moment, so we don't know how it actually performs in a collision, but it's nice to know that we do have that third row airbag coverage. So bravo Ssangyong there. Coming around to the boot of the Rexton now, we open up the power tailgate. The power tailgate is added on the Adventure and Beyond, so of course it's on this Ultimate we have here. Bit slow, but you know, you get what you pay for, I suppose, and we reveal a decent amount of room behind the third row here. Look, it's enough to put a few bags and things like that while still having all rows in place, which I can't say for all vehicles out there. We pop them down like so, and we reveal 641 litres of space. Not bad. And if you chuck down the second row as well, that expands to over 1,800 litres. We've got a few amenities back here, like a few little hooks and things like that. And we also have a 12-volt socket here, which is technically shared with the third row, plus a little bit of underfloor storage section here. So look, all in all, not too bad. Though when I come out here and I press the tailgate again, Makes a pretty weird noise, and I'm not really sure what to make of that, but you know, some fun quirks, I suppose. Now, while we're at the back of the Rexton, let's quickly talk about towing, because this is a bit of a strength of this model. It's rated for 3.5, and you can't say that for all of the rivals in this class, and it does a reasonably good job too. Previously, we've towed about 2.7 tons with the Rexton, and it did a pretty decent job, so some solid marks for the Rexton there. Now let's talk about running costs. So this is another bit of a strength for the Rexton. As part of their 777 deal, you get 7 years unlimited kilometer warranty, you get 7 years of roadside assistance, and you get 7 years of cap price servicing. Now over 5 years, you're gonna pay $1,875, and the intervals are every 12 months or 15,000 kilometers. But what about fuel economy? So this is an interesting one. The official combined consumption claim is 8.7 liters per 100 Ks. In my week of driving, I've seen about 9.3. However, in previous testing we've done with the Rexton, it showed better fuel economy performance and actually better than some of its rivals out there. So another bit of a tick for the Rexton there. So what's it like to drive the Ssangyong Rexton? Well, look, I'll be honest, I really do like this segment, you know, the 4x4 wagons, because I just think the versatility and what you can do with it is just so impressive. And the Rexton is a good example of this. Starting with the basics, we've got a 2.2 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder in this one, 148 kilowatts of power, 441 Newton meters of torque. Look, it's certainly not lacking in terms of those figures, you know, not best in class, but I think they're certainly pretty respectable. They do have a tendency to come on pretty strong. It's similar to Isuzu's engine in that regards. They're 3 litre, just really kind of sudden with the power delivery at times. Though I do think you get used to it a bit more as you drive it. It's paired to an 8-speed automatic transmission. It's pretty inoffensive, stands at your way. It's exactly what you want. Now, during my week with the Rexton, I've driven it in a multitude of different driving situations. Starting with on-road, in the dry, it's quite interesting. It behaves fairly well, although it is a little bit prone to a little bit of fussy behavior when you go over certain bumps. And there were times when I was driving along the road and it seemed to be fairly flat and fuss-free, and I was still feeling a bit of fussiness path through to the cabin. So that's a little bit disappointing. But it's really in the wet where the Rexton was starting to become undone, I think. So unfortunately, because this has got a part-time 4x4 system, it is prone to a little bit of skittish behavior in wet weather. But I do think this is more so than a lot of cars out there, such as the Fortuner, for example. There's a bit of a nasty combination of that sudden torque delivery and then also the traction control just clamping down really quick. That meant when I needed to pull out of the way, when I was going across a T-junction where there's a bit of traffic each way and things like that, that unfortunately it didn't feel as safe and secure as I would have liked it to. You kind of lurch forward, then stop, lurch forward, then stop. And that only got worse when I started to go round corners. There was one example when I was driving in some rural roads and I was behind a Skoda Octavia, you know, previous Chasing Cars Car of the Year winner, and for a good reason. But I also don't think that its dynamics are the best of the best in this world. It's just a family car sedan wagon at the end of the day. And I was driving behind this lovely old couple who were in this Octavia, and we're only in a 50 or 60 zone, but the Rexton was really struggling to keep up. We came to a series of corners like I'm on now when I went down and then took a sudden left, and I experienced absolutely stacks of understeer. And then when the front wheels finally started to bite, I experienced a bit of oversteer. Of course, the traction control caught it and I didn't have any big slidey moments, but I certainly wasn't able to take that corner with any kind of confidence. And that was a real dampener on the experience, I've got to say.
Now, some 4 drives do drive better than others, and for the most part, that does come down to the fundamental tuning of the chassis, which Ssangyong says they have worked to improve for this facelift, but it's clear that there still is a little bit of a way to go. But perhaps some of the oversteering antics could be resolved by switching from a part-time to a full-time 4-wheel drive system in a future update, like so many models in this segment are doing, to help resolve some of the unpredictability when driving in slippery conditions.
Now, I did mention there that the ride is a little bit fussy at times, and that is a little bit disappointing considering that Ssangyong has actually done some extra work here to try and improve the compliance. I don't think it's anything particularly disastrous, but I certainly don't think it's ideal. And when I started to go rural, or I went in some pretty torn up urban areas, it did start to annoy me a little bit. Though in saying that, I do think this whole segment could use a bit of a lift. You know, like when I've been driving the Pajero Sport, and also I think the MU-X to a bit of a degree, they both don't perform as well as they probably should. The MU-X is probably a little bit softer, but in general, I do think they're not as disciplined as they could be. So what about in terms of safety? Well, look, unfortunately, there is no ANCAP rating for the Rexton here. On the upside, we do actually have a bit of safety equipment in the Rexton. 9 airbags to start, and as I mentioned in the interior section, it does cover all the way to the third row, which is just fantastic to see. Bravo, Ssangyong, for that one. We've also got things like blind spot monitoring, and we do have rear cross traffic alert and lane keep assistance. However, all of those are just alerts. They don't have any kind of intervention, which is what we're starting to see on newer models. So that's the everyday stuff out of the way, but what is it like to drive the Rexton off-road? Unfortunately, this isn't one of this model's strong points. I went onto a trail that I've been on with several of this car's main competitors, Pajero Sport, MU-X for example, and both of those vehicles went through that environment without much fuss at all. I will note that this time I went through after it had been raining and it was a little bit slippery, a little bit wet, and a bit more puddles and things like that everywhere. But I do think that overall, the experience wasn't quite as easygoing as it was in those models. For high driving, this is perfectly fine. You know, the suspension's pretty compliant. It can take up most of the punishment that, you know, ripped up dirt roads have to offer and keep on your merry way. It's pretty consistent in its power delivery. But unfortunately, when you switch to 4 low and you start to do the trickier stuff is where this model falls a bit short. So this does have a few tricks up its sleeve. For example, it's got an auto-locking rear differential. Look, personally, I prefer to have the ability to lock the differential myself. So if I see a tricky environment, I can simply just switch it on before I go into that situation, instead of going up there, getting stuck halfway, then it working, you know, not necessarily ideal. I've also got this engine, which, as I said, has a good amount of torque. It's a little peaky, but I think once you lock it into low range, as I said, it's a little bit more even in its power delivery. So certainly a bit of an upside for the model there. But the point where the Rexton really starts to experience issues is ground clearance. You know, it's a pretty fundamental part of a 4x4, and the Rexton doesn't perform well on this one, as I alluded to earlier in the video. So 203 millimeters of ground clearance, and for a bit of context, if you look at a Subaru Forester, which is a bit of an outlier in its segment, I must say, has 220 millimeters, and you know, that's a soft-roader. It's not really something you would expect. You would expect a little bit more from a 4x4 such as this. And unfortunately, it's pretty long overhangs, meaning that it doesn't really have great approach, departure, or breakover angles either. They're all about 20 or 20.5 in measurement. And for reference, when we look at the Isuzu MU-X, that's got 230 millimeters, and its approach and departure angles are much closer to around the 30-degree mark. So you simply have the ability to go up to certain rocks and go up and over them. And really, I think the end result was that I just wasn't game to tackle a lot of obstacles which I thought looked pretty approachable ordinarily. You know, they're obstacles that I've surmounted in other full drives without even getting out of the car. But I found myself, you know, stopping, putting it in park, having a look and going, nah, I don't think so. I'm not going to risk it. And that's not just owing to the fact that the ground clearance isn't great. It's also the fact that it's got a really square design on that front bumper. You know, I probably could have helped things by taking off the rear tow bar, but even still, as those angles suggest, it probably wouldn't have performed that much better anyway. And look, few four-wheel drives are at their full potential right out of the box, which is why the aftermarket is just so big in Australia. You know, we love our 4x4s and we love making them even better. And I do think it's notable that when you look at some of the major players when it comes to aftermarket modifications, there doesn't really seem to be that absolute wealth of options that you do have with some of the more popular models out there, which unfortunately does mean that if you want to overcome some of this model's key off-roading deficiencies, it's just going to be a little bit harder. The 2024 update for the Ssangyong Rexton has no doubt improved this vehicle. It's simply better all round, and it's got a much better interior, and the price is still pretty friendly too. The clear value buy is the new adventure grade. The extra $4,000 to go to this Ultimate doesn't really stack up in my mind in terms of value, and even less if you go for that extra $2,000 pack. Now, I have been a little bit picky with the Rexton today, and that's because I want you guys to know all the good and the bad points before you sign on the dotted line for one. But when you can take into consideration the price of this thing, look, it's a pretty good value proposition. In saying that, if I was looking for a more affordable 4x4 wagon, I'm not really sure this is what I'd go for. Mainly, that's due to some fundamental deficiencies of the Rexton, like its off-road capability, on-road competency, and also its aging safety tech. If you're willing to tolerate the safety nannies of the GWM Tank range, the GWM Tank 300 is a good option if you want a 5-seater with a bit of retro chic. Or the Tank 500 has a bit of a Prado-esque persona going for it. Both have better ground clearance than this model, they're a bit more refined, and the 500 has a form of full-time 4x4. However, it is notable that neither of those vehicles can tow what this thing can. Personally, if it was me in this situation, and I did have a little bit more money to stretch a bit further upmarket, I think I would be looking towards those more established rivals. They may not have the feature list of this Ssangyong, but examples like the Isuzu MU-X are just a bit more competent all round, and they do have more aftermarket support. So that is something to consider. But anyway, those have just been my thoughts on the 2024 Ssangyong Rexton. Let me know yours down in the comments below. Do you have a Rexton and are you looking to buy one? I really want to hear about it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. But for now, that's all. Thank you for watching Chasing Cars.